Good evening, friends.
Good evening.
Nice. We are delighted and excited to be with you for this pre-concert conversation. I am your host for the evening, Fredara Hadley. I'm an ethnomusicology professor at the Juilliard School right across the street, and I'm excited to be joined by each person on this stage. And let me just tell you, you're in for a really beautiful night, both in this conversation and in the concert to follow. I'm going to tell you a little bit about each person. If I told you everything, that would be the conversation. But I want you to know, if you don't already, who you're hearing from. To my right, we have Nathalie Joachim. I did it? Hey.
You got it.
Yes. Nathalie is a Grammy-nominated performer and composer. The Haitian-American artist is hailed for being a fresh and invigorating cross-cultural voice. Her creative practice centers on authentic commitment to storytelling and human connectivity while advocating for social change, cultural awareness, gaining her reputation of being powerful and unpretentious, just like this suit. Yes, ma'am? And we are delighted to have with us Seth Parker Woods, hailed by The Guardian as a cellist of power and grace, who possesses mature artistry and willingness to go to the brink. Two-time Grammy-nominated cellist Seth Parker Woods has established his reputation as a versatile artist and innovator across multiple genres. Woods' projects delve deep into our cultural fabric, reimagining traditional works and commissioning new ones to propel classical music into the future. Welcome, Seth.
Thank you.
Wow.
We are also happy to have with us Monica Miller, Professor of Africana Studies, Chair of the Africana Studies Department, absolutely, at Barnard College. Professor Miller specializes in African American and American literature and cultural studies. Her research interests include 20th and 21st century African American literature, film and contemporary art, contemporary literature and the culture of Black diaspora, performance studies, and intersectional studies of race, gender, and sexuality. Her book, Slaves to Fashion, Black Dandyism, and the Styling of Black Diasporic Identity, was published by Duke University Press in 2009 and has received several prizes, and you're working on another book now, I believe. Research, she's like, maybe.
Always.
Always, it's true.
Always in process. Yes.
Inspired by Professor Miller's research, the Costume Institute's Spring 2025 exhibition and Met Gala will focus on Black dandies in an exhibit entitled Superfine, Tailoring Black Style, which will be guest curated by Professor Miller. So congratulations.
Thank you. Thank you.
Last, and of course not least, we have Carol Oja, William Powell Mason Professor of Music and Historical Musicology at Harvard University. Her research focuses on the history of American music and culture. Her most recent book, Bernstein Meets Broadway, Collaborative Art in a Time of War, received the Music and American Culture Award from the American Musicological Society. Her Making Music Modern, New York in the 1920s, won the Lowens Book Award for the Society of American Music. Sounding Together Collaborative Perspectives on U.S. Music in the 21st Century, co-edited with Charles Garrett, is forthcoming from the University of Michigan Press. And she is at work on a book provisionally titled Civil Rights in the Concert Hall, Marian Anderson and the Struggle Against Racial Segregation in Classical Music Performance. Welcome.
Thank you. That sounds great.
So I'd like to start with an opening question for everyone, and feel free to chime in whenever you like. Unless you like going in order, that's fine too. But we're here for a concert and programming entitled Afromodernism, Music of the African Diaspora. The question of modernity and identity making and music making is a recurring one that seems to be asked anew with every generation. And so I'm interested, terms are complicated. They can be loaded, we can argue against them. I'd like us to think about what a term like modernism or Afro-modernism reveals or helps us to see more clearly in our creative expressions, in our music, in our clothing, in our creative practices.
I mean, I guess to me, what the term specifically Afro-modernism reveals two things to me. That there is maybe a perceived need for some sort of distinction between modernism and whoever that may belong to, and Afro-modernism and whoever that may belong to. I think it also reveals to me that there is also a need to express this idea that what is Afro or African diasporic can be qualified as modern, right? Which to me also implies this very sort of heavy and hard history of being labeled as primitive. And so those are two revealing and things that I like to challenge, because of course, to me, to be modern is to be expressing within the time that you're existing in, and in such a way that is forward-looking. And Black people have always been doing that. We've always existed, and we've always been making, so we have always been doing that. So that's, I think, what it reveals for me.
Same. I mean, I guess in short, I don't want to make this too big, but that it's an expansion on kind of where we have come from, and also maybe where we actually are. Maybe a new lens is lent to stories of the past and stories of our actual present. I think in spinning it in a way that makes it maybe more accessible, or brings more things to the forefront that maybe have been also lost or erased. Yeah.
I mean, I'll jump in. I think that when I think of the term Afromodernism, I think of two different writers who I really admire. I think first of Toni Morrison, and then I think also of Robert Farris Thompson. And when I think of Toni Morrison, I'm thinking, when Toni Morrison spoke about modernity, what she meant in terms of modernity was so much about how the modern subject feels him or herself to be really fractured and fragmented, right? I mean, that's how high modernism defines modernism. But she actually takes that moment of feeling fractured and fragmented and brings it all the way back to the Middle Passage, right? She's saying it didn't happen in 1920, right? It happened, in 1620. So I think of her, and I think of that sense of the sense of the dating of that modernity as being really, really associated with Blackness in the world, right? And Blackness, kind of cast out of Africa and into the diaspora, right? So I feel like that's part of it. The other thing is, when I think of Robert Farris Thompson, I think of the ways in which he wanted to think about Afro-modernism as something, and this might be controversial, and I don't know if he meant it this way, but this is what I take from it, as also a kind of identity project that's really related to urbanity, right? And then also not just to when sort of like white modernism meets Afro-modernism, but when different Black modernisms meet each other, right? In a diasporic space. So when I think about how generative the term Afro-modernism is, it's really reflecting Morrison talking about modernity being something that is sort of inherently concerned with Blackness, and then with Afro-modernism being this meeting, right, of different Blacknesses in diaspora.
Was beautiful. Yeah. Yeah, as a historian, I guess I would throw in that Afro-modernism seems to me in part a site for a powerful, exuberant, creative challenge to the white power structure. And dating back as far as you just went, but certainly to the Harlem Renaissance, to the 1920s, to the early early 20th century. This was a time period of Black voices gaining power outside of Black communities. I mean, interacting more vigorously and challenging the white, and especially within the music world, the white structure around them. Also a time of crossing genres and boundaries and geographies. And as thinking ahead to this concert, I was reminded of Duke Ellington and his phrase about beyond category. And that's in a way what Afromodernism is. It's beyond category. It's getting rid of the labels and just embracing creativity and the Black experience. So.
Thank you. I hear some through lines in each of your answers. The idea of, I'm going to go to your word, a lens, a way of sort of interpreting both past and present. And I'm thinking about, Professor Miller, how you reminded us through Toni Morrison to kind of reset the timeline and reframe the timeline, which reorders so many aspects of how we're thinking about modernity in general, Afro-modernity in particular. And it is the Middle Passage which causes or sort of creates the diaspora in the first place, right? And so now I'm thinking about your piece and your work in general, but I'm thinking about Had to Be, which we'll hear tonight. And I know that diaspora is so much a part of your work and just who you are in the world. And so I wondered if you could tell us a bit more of how that shows up in the cello concerto that we'll hear Seth Parker Woods play this evening. Yes.
Yeah. I think, you know, it's also interesting in this context of modernity is that one thing that did for sure happen in the Middle Passage is that we carried with us what I like to call and think of as our indigenous technologies, right? Our spirituality, our storytelling, our artistic expressive practices, and those are things that connect us very deeply to the continent, right? And what's been beautiful to see as Blackness gets reinvented in all of these spaces and reimagined throughout the diaspora is how deeply we're constantly reaching back to those technologies, right? And so in this piece, I tried to do that, right? I tried to do that in this deep way that it was really about exploring Black stylistic expression in a musical context, reaching back into that space and also, you know, abstracting it to push it forward, right? To help us see it in different ways. I think you see that not just in my piece, but overarchingly in the entire program this evening is that you hear how each of the four composers featured on the concert really have shared languages that we're wielding in quite unique ways, right? And to some extent, that is the most exciting, the most exciting aspect of modernity to me in this sense is that there is a way for us to be constantly reaching back to push forward, reaching back to push forward. And I tried to do that. It was a fun challenge to be able to do that. And maybe not all of the references are caught by everyone, but that also is, I think, a really valuable and subversive notion of modernity, right? That the messages included in the work may not be received or read by everyone, but are available to be tapped into not only tonight, but hopefully somebody reaching back someday in the future from now.
I have a follow-up question for you. I really love how you talked about we traveled with these technologies inside of us because so much of the narrative is everything was lost in the slave trade. Yeah. And there were things lost, absolutely, but not everything was lost. And so I'm thinking about ideas of ritual that survived and made it to this side. And so I kind of previewed this question for you, but how does the notion of ritual connect, which some may feel is the opposite of modernity, but that doesn't feel true. So can you talk about the relationship between the two?
Yes, for sure. I mean, spoiler alert, there is a brass band that plays at the very beginning of this piece. And the inspiration for me was actually a field recording that I made when I was, my family is from Haiti, and I was on our land writing this piece for Seth, actually. And what happens in our small village when somebody passes away is that there's a funeral ceremony, and then there is a procession that happens that's led by a brass band through the village, which is really an invitation for everyone to come out of their homes, walk in this celebration of life, to send this spirit off with light and with life and with music. And the first thing that I thought of also was Seth's family's roots in New Orleans, and how you see the fabric of that happening in this funeral march in Haiti, but you also see the fabric of that in New Orleans' second line, right? And so, yes, like, perhaps of course there were things that were lost, but there are obviously things that we continue to wield in these very different ways, right? And they're stylistically quite different. They appear differently in their expression, but it is something that tied us, and so it became like very important. That's like one example of ritual that I think is important, and also that like what wasn't lost is what was embodied by us, right? And so that is why I think these technologies survived in ways that perhaps other things didn't, is because those things we carry with us generation after generation. It's built into our DNA, and is a force that we can continue to tap into.
That's so beautiful, and I know the name of that movement is homegoing, right? Because part of the rituals or body of rituals that are so important are those around death, right? How we send one home, how we send one on from this realm. And so thank you for sharing that with us. Professor Oja, I have a question for you based on what we were just saying about the program. In the first half of the program, we have two pieces that premiered within the last year, Carla Simon's piece and your piece, which premiered earlier this year at Spoleto. The second half of the program takes us into the 1970s with David Baker's Kosbro, and then into 1947 with William Grant Still's Symphony No. 4. And so I'm curious, as a historian, as a historical musicologist, how do you hear the threads of Afro-modernity through those earlier works in the 20th century?
Well, starting with Still, who was composing as early as 1920 and wrote probably his most famous piece, the Afro-American Symphony, in 1930. I looked into the amazing digital archives of the Philharmonic before coming here to see how much Still was performed. And on the one hand, the history of any major institution like the Philharmonic, the racial history, is complicated in many ways. On the other, it was really surprising and reassuring to see that, especially at the stadium concerts that took place in Lewiston Stadium in Harlem, with the Philharmonic Orchestra performing, this was in the summer, that Still's music was heard every year or two for a good long time. So there's a connection between Still and this orchestra, this institution that's important. With David Baker, I didn't do so well looking up for information, but then I learned from Gabe Smith yesterday, who is the archivist, that the digital archives go up to 1970, and it's really, I think, 1973 when David Baker, so it just hasn't, he was too young in some ways to make it into that archive. But in that case, the conductor for him was Everett Lee, a black conductor who ended up making his career in Sweden, started in the 1940s with building an orchestra of his own in Harlem, sort of outside of the system most of the time. And yet, during the bicentennial especially, he had a number of invitations to conduct in the United States, including for the Philharmonic, and that David Baker piece was one of those. So it was a moment for him that was important professionally, but also made one aware, looking back on it, of just the exclusions that surrounded it.
Thank you. Did you want to?
No, I'm just really excited to learn all of that.
She pulled the receipts. I'm always appreciative of that.
Yeah.
So I'm thinking about, and I mentioned this to you all earlier, this Zora Neale Hurston writes about the will to adorn, right? And ethnomusicologist Portia Maltby writes in her Aesthetics of Black Music that one's physical presentation, one's style of dress is not superficial, but it is an essential part of the performance itself, right? And I know that this is something that you think deeply about as a cellist, Seth, and so I'd love to hear your own interpretation of ideas of performance, adornment, and how those merge in creating your artistic statement and visions.
Yeah, I think all of that stems actually from my childhood, actually, with my mother's in the audience. Hi, Mom. And so my mother and father kind of set the groundwork because they are of a generation where they didn't go anywhere without being dressed up. And I mean fully, even to the grocery store. So this was already something in the way in which they adorned us, the way in which they dressed us up, and many times matching, my brother and I and my sister all kind of having matching outfits or something similar. So this idea and the ways in which they put us together gives us kind of a palette to start to work from. And then I think for me, at least, it was so important to figure out, for years I was wearing all black, all black, all black, because that became kind of like the orchestral and then like the contemporary new music model of dress. And I got tired of that because I felt like, yes, it is a model. It allows everybody to kind of be of the same, but we're not monoliths in that way. So I felt that at a certain point, maybe 8 years ago, that it was time to start to bring in more of who I was to the stage and not just sonically. And so lending to the past, lending to see what my mother was doing back then, or remembering what my grandfather, what my grandmother. So even what I wore yesterday was commissioned. So every single wardrobe you'll see me as I perform this concerto here in Montreal next, I've commissioned a series of different looks for those. So yesterday's was an homage to my mother and to the magnolia trees that we grew up around. So those things adorn in a way that it's also a sense of minimalism and maximalism at the same time, with the overlaying of those magnolias as an offering of flowers, an offering of thanks, but also in the same way, there's this beautiful friendship between Nathalie and I, and our connections to what it is, and I think also our shared cultures as well, and what it is to layer, what it is to build on that which we've kind of come up seeing, and we've then kind of redefined as we've grown into our own selves. I think that's it, yeah.
Are you sure?
No, there's more, but
Take a beat. I wanted to ask as a follow-up, as you stepped more into your own sartorial vision for yourself, was there how was it in dialogue with your musical self? Were there any shifts on stage? And I'm thinking specifically about, y'all went in for a cheap treat with this cello concerto and the vulnerabilities that it requires. And it strikes me that, and you please correct me, if one is at home in one's body and dress, that it becomes either armor or easier to give that kind of vulnerability to the audience. Do you have thoughts about?
Yes, there is the shield, but I think in this movement, to date, there is nothing I've played that's more vulnerable. Only in that, because of the way in which Nathalie writes, I've always said this in all of the pieces, you hear her voice, you hear the vocal quality in that writing. So there's this sense that it becomes like the first instrument, which is our voice in that way. And it's being circumvented through the cello. And because they're very, very long lines in many ways, it really exposes a different type of virtuosity. So even though there is the clothing, there is the cello, it's almost like she's pulled me from behind the cello, and it's me against.
Let me get it.
Can we get a tissue? So therefore, it really is, I've always said it's the protagonists on display in their most vulnerable, but also their most beautiful state. And I'm just delivering me. Yeah.
You'll hear it. It's so exciting.
It sounds a little abstract now, but you're going to be like, yep, that's exactly what they were talking about for years tonight. Professor Miller, while we're in this world of thinking about dress and all of it, you, in your work, you talk about, again, the gravitas of how one presents in the world and an active identity making, and how the idea of being Black is something that was not always, but something that has to be crafted and is born out of, colonialism, slave trade, all of it. So can you share with us, and you think a lot about diaspora as well.
Absolutely.
And so we would love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just responding to this beautiful, beautiful way in which you described the way your self-presentation on this sort of spectrum, right? And on a spectrum that's not just about, you're wearing one ensemble for this, you're wearing another ensemble for that, but the way that even one ensemble allows you to be simultaneously or at the same time, in a feeling protected, right? And also putting yourself out there, right? So there's this kind of really beautiful way in which you describe that, which I think is part of the sort of larger spectrum of how we think about I think Afro-diasporic identity and its relationship to fashion and dress, right? I mean, sometimes one, dresses in a way, right, to conform, right, to slide through, right, to make it smooth, right, and then sometimes one dresses in a way to be noticed, right, for an audience or sometimes for the self, right? So there's so many different ways in which clothing and dress is so essential, right, to identity. And I think in particular I do think about the particularity of that, like the real particularity of that for Black people. When you were talking about the way in which your mom would dress you in those outfits, what she was doing is she was creating community, right? She was saying, these 3 kids are mine, right? They belong to me and each other, right? So there's a way in which like that, or for example, I talk about this a lot, but the ways in which African-American people in particular want to dress in this, like in monochrome, right?
I love.
Exactly. I'm just saying, nothing wrong with it.
You're in good company.
The full orange, the full lavender, the full whatever, right? And the way in which that's the will to adorn, but that's also like the desire. There's a sort of discipline there. There's a joy. There's a let me do this head to toe, right? And then, sometimes if you're out on the street, somebody would say, "I see you, purple."
Yeah, right? That's my favorite. That's my favorite.
It's always about, it's so much about like the self, right? But it's so much about the self. It's also about community. It's also about like being, in a social world, right, or multiple kinds of social worlds. So so the way that you described all of that, just within your family, it's also very familial, right? So many people get dress traditions from their grandparents, from their parents, from their cousins. Your cousin brings whatever that new thing is, right? It's so much about heritage, right, in a really beautiful way.
Yeah. I'm laughing when you said, I see you purple, because I saw Natalie on the plaza earlier today. I was like, okay, mustard coat.
I had a yellow coat.
That was gorgeous. So we literally did that.
Yes.
But speaking of which, I wondered if you'd be willing to share about what we are experiencing with your suit.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Thanks for asking. Yes, similar to Seth, I wanted not the outfits just for this, but and every time I step on stage, I want to be seen as my whole self, and I also want to be able to share story. I think of myself primarily as a storyteller. This is a suit that is made by a Brooklyn-based designer named Kwasi Paul, but the suit itself was custom made in Ghana. And when you get for me, the color red, being Haitian, is a very every little Haitian girl had that red bow, that red scrunchie, that red dress. That it's a very strong color for us, especially coming into the new year, and something that our parent, or my mother for sure, always adorned us in, and was an important color and is an important color in Haiti. But if you get closer, if you have a chance to see me up close later, the suit is actually lined with cowrie shells. And that throughout the continent was seen as a sort of currency, a sign of wealth, a sign of trading, a sign of community. And so to be adorned in something that is so simple but was traded amongst us and really represented something so much more, but also comes from the earth with this beautiful fabric, cotton that was picked and again, made handmade specifically in Ghana. It is an outfit for me that also connects my story from Haiti back to the continent, and also lifts up a young designer that's from my home city of Brooklyn, New York. And so it felt important to wear this tonight. Last night I wore an outfit that really represented my new home city of Philadelphia, lifting up a young Philadelphia designer named Blue Badger, and also an outfit that was styled and procured at a Black vintage archive in Philadelphia called More Vintage Archive. So it is important for me, like Seth, to be able to tell stories through these clothing, but also to be seen, right? To be seen as whole, to not be missed, and to, that there is a quote that's inspired in large part this piece. An Olympian named Tommy Smith said, "We had to be seen because we had to be heard." And so one thing you'll never find me doing is wearing specifically concert black for that reason, especially in spaces that weren't designed to hold us, in spaces that weren't designed to sort of carry our story. It feels particularly important to do with intention.
And you also can't see her nails are done.
My nails
too,
is
so
also did.
The theme is followed. I'm thinking about Ramsey's essay in this program, and he talks about Black composers and musicians making themselves at home in classical music, right? And so you're mentioning the shedding of concert black. You're mentioning the Tommy Smith quote and the need to be seen in order to be heard. And it strikes me that there's much that's been written, like, is this a different moment? Is this a lasting moment in classical music where the fullness of one's African, Black American, Caribbean, all of the above self can be fully seen and heard in the classical musical world? What are your thoughts about if that is where we are?
Will it be a lasting moment? Well, we certainly hope so. I mean, but we know, and like perhaps your expertise in terms of like understanding the history with this organization specifically, but that change has been hard to come, right? And so it is challenging to see how slow it is, but it also is a motivator to keep making, right? And to keep making in such a way that is deeply authentic, that doesn't get watered down or filtered because it has to be sort of structurally watered down through the Western classical lens, right? To conform, to not lose ourselves in that, and also to claim more space, right? That in fact, we aren't outsiders of this world. We have the pedigree that comes along with...
We come from the pedigree.
Yes, we have...
Of it.
Yeah, exactly. And so to claim more space and to keep doing it as loudly as possible, we hope it will be a lasting change, but the change has been slow to come.
Mm-hmm. Professor Oja, we can clap for that. Yes. You kind of peeked into my brain because I wanted to know, where are we in terms of classical music history when we have a 2-night concert series called Afromodernism at the New York Philharmonic? Can you tell us where we are in your work and thinking about classical music and segregation, or sort of these periods of embracing and then sort of fading? Where do you see us now in 2024?
Well, it seems to me that having a celebration like this, having the two of you involved, having all this music performed is just, it's just a wondrous change. And clearly, music by Black composers and Black performers have been involved with the New York Philharmonic and other major orchestras in the United States before. But it seems to me that really since the murder of George Floyd, there's been a wake-up call to just the necessity of opening the door of embracing more people, more traditions, just broadening the gambit. And it's happening at the same time as, these are old institutions, and they've got a library stocked with scores that come from European heritage, and all that music's beautiful. So I'm not saying that's not the case, but change is slow. But I mean, it seems to me this is just an amazing sign of change. One thing I wanted to say when you were quoting Guthrie Ramsay about being at home in the concert hall is William Grant Still probably never felt at home in a concert hall. It's a sad thing to say, but he wrote about that. His wife, who was a journalist, wrote about it. So even though he continued producing, I mean, all of you will hear the symphony by him that the orchestras played last night and will play again tonight is just gorgeous. And the orchestra respected it and loved it. I mean, you could just feel that. But he's not here to witness that, unfortunately. Yeah.
I'm thinking about what you reminded us about William Grant Still's life, and I'm always, when I think about Black composers from earlier periods, their compulsion, their commitment to create, knowing that the pieces may never be heard by, places like this. Or I remember we were talking about, or the New York Philharmonic did a piece by Adolphus Hailstork, and he was here to hear that piece performed. And I was reading the program notes, and they were like, this is a New York Philharmonic premiere, but not a world premiere, because it was actually premiered at HBCU, Norfolk State University, where he taught, right? And so I'm thinking about both individual composers' interactions with these institutions, but also institutions like HBCUs with places like this, right? And I'm thinking about the audience as well. I saw so many people last night for whom this was their first time at the New York Philharmonic, and we were talking about how the poster was all over the city, and the artwork grabbed them, and it felt like, okay, this looks like something I'm supposed to go to, that I want to go to. What message do we have for audience members for whom this may be their first time coming? How do we encourage audiences who didn't grow up going to see the Philadelphia Orchestra or the New York Phil to feel embodied, to claim their space in the audience as well? How can we think about that?
I'm looking at you, Seth. I haven't said nothing in a while.
I feel that they should just come. They really should come. I think there are maybe a handful, maybe slightly more orchestras and those that are doing the artistic planning that are really finally saying, yes, we are going to do these things, or they're partnering with other performers or curators that have their ear to the pulse of what's happening, and they're really trying to change the landscape. I mean, this program in and of itself was really a village to kind of bring to light in many ways. I grew up going to the symphony only because I had started studying classical music, but I can't say whether my family or my mother's, direct, siblings and such, had they gone to the Houston Symphony, where I'm from, as kids, probably not. So it becomes I think it becomes one person can help it become a catalyst for opening more of those doors. And I think having, just even if it's a few people that kind of can believe in what the programming can possibly be, or stretching to go beyond something that you don't know, and maybe that you may be quite interesting. What was interesting for me yesterday was to see so many young people in the audience. It was really amazing. I think it's so rare that we are experiencing that in a way, especially if you're a performer on the stage looking out, where it's not like a young people's concert, they're amazing. And, I went to so many of them as kids, and that's what really kind of pulled me in many ways and kind of helped me understand what was actually happening in those spaces. But to have them come to these giant subscription concerts and then the intergenerationalness as well that was actually happening, well, even here right now. So I think it's amazing. So I feel as even if you love this program, I would say continue to come back or find the programs that actually do work for you. And I don't think everything is going to be for you, but there may be something within each season, even if it's coming once or twice per season. Yeah.
I would just add to that like what felt beautiful about yesterday was that it was a very different audience that is normally here, and they were made to feel welcome. And so if we are going to be inviting people, whether that's audience members, composers, performers, into these spaces, to embrace us as our whole full selves, right? And to allow for the space for that, and for the institutions that are doing the inviting to have it be a true invitation, right? And to me, that concept hits really deep. Like, I come from a people where we are welcoming, if nothing else, right? That inviting you into our home is a serious invitation. It's not something that we take lightly. And it is up to us to do the work to make you feel as at home as you can be in that space. Not to invite you into a space that utterly shows you only signs that you shouldn't be there, or that you're othered, or that you're different, right? And so there's that work to be done, I think, on this institutional side, as like a constant change in the cultural thinking or cultural understanding that it's more than just putting us on stage, but it is about making these spaces a home that we feel like we can be welcomed into again and again and again, and not just on a few programs here and there during the year. Right? Yes.
I think it's also important that even with the symphony, we always say this is the people's symphony, it's the symphony of, or the orchestra of this city, and so many times those programs don't actually reflect the actual makeup of those cities. So that I give it up to quite a few orchestras that really do, the programming really starts to look like the city, and then the people that come into those spaces does drastically change. So I charge every orchestra really to make sure you really are the people's symphony. That is why you're here. Yeah.
Amen. Yeah. Absolutely, amen. And I'm thinking about, again, last night, which was a beautiful night from start to finish, and making people feel welcome for that audience. I spoke to people at intermission afterwards, and one of the things people were responding to was hearing themselves on stage, right? And how important it is to hear themselves in the music that is chosen and curated for these performances, but also to see y'all, right? Like, to bring it back to the visual, to see you come up on stage and take your bows, to see you as the soloist in the concerto, right? All of those images together help to reframe for audiences what classical music is, and the possibility of what it can be. And that was, as many times as I've been here, it was the strongest last night to sort of witness. You all would agree, like, that was one of the things that was super special for.
Yeah, I mean, I'll try to keep this brief, but to share an anecdote, I started my musical studies at the Juilliard School in the Music Advancement Program, which is a program that was designed to service inner city kids who did not have arts programs elsewhere in the city. And I played my very first concerto as a young flutist right here on this stage with the Little Orchestra Society of Lincoln Center when I was 11 years old. And so at our first rehearsal, fast forward, here we are 30 years later, to stand in front of the New York Philharmonic and say, 11-year-old me would never have imagined not only that I would be on this stage ever again, but in this capacity. And to bring it further, I did an interview during intermission with a social media influencer, and I had seen her name in the email, but then when I saw her face, I recognized her as a young flutist who was a student at the Music Advancement Program when I taught there, when I was a faculty member there. And to have her see me in this position and say to me, you know, you inspired me then. The little 11-year-old me back then saw you and made me realize it was possible. And you have no idea how every step of the way, following your career, watching what you've done, has brought me here. I'm still making music. I've started this social media platform that highlights Black artists and composers. And that in large part is because I saw you. I saw myself in you. And so that has been a beautiful sort of full circle moment that has happened in real time here, and is a testament to the fact that being able to identify with what you see and what you hear makes it possible for you to realize something completely that may have been once unthinkable for you, right? And so that is also why it's important.
Well, I think you just brought this conversation to a beautiful close. Please join me in thanking our panel for this evening.